Hello, everyone. I'm Jimmy Abbott, the priest at Holy Comforter Episcopal Church in Spring, Texas. And we're beginning our fall adult education series called Liturgy, the Work of the People. So, during this time of social distance, when we haven't been in church, when our liturgy and worship has been disrupted, I thought it was an especially important time for us to think critically about our liturgy and about our worship. And I think maybe just because we have some space from it, that we might be able to think about it in fresh ways and in new ways. So I appreciate y'all joining with me for this series, The Work of the People. It's kind of fun being up here in this tiny little box. But anyway, this is how it's going to happen. Every week, you will get a short video from me like this that covers some topic along the lines of liturgy and worship, our Book of Common Prayer, the particular way that we do things as Episcopalians. And then once a month, we will gather on Zoom on Sundays at 10 a.m. for a discussion section about what we've been going over. Those discussion sections will take place on, let me make sure I get this right, August 30th, September 20th, October 11th, and November 5th. Of course, you'll get all the reminders that you need for that, and I'll be talking about that. We'll gather on Zoom, so you can jump in, join the conversation, join the discussion. And, of course, be looking at your Holy Comforter emails so that you are up to date and you know where to click, what to do, and how to join us. So there are a few resources that you might want to pick up along the way that will help guide you in our discussions here and what we'll be learning in Liturgy, the Work of the People. The first is your Book of Common Prayer. Here's my trusty Book of Common Prayer. I have the Book of Common Prayer and Hymnal Companion. Look at that. Look how hefty that is. It's a prayer book and a hymnal all in one volume. The other thing that you might want to get is the Book of Occasional Services, or as one of our parishioners calls it, the Book of Unusual Services. You can download that. It's online. Just Google it, Book of Occasional Services, Episcopal Church. Those are all the services that are occasional. The blessing of a home, or the Thanksgiving for the anniversary of a marriage. I think that's a pretty cool one. That's where it's from this book, the Book of Occasional Services, that we got the liturgy for our groundbreaking. Remember that service way back when in 2017? So all those services that don't take place frequently are all there in the Book of Occasional Services. There are two other books that I'd encourage you to pick up if you want to do some more reading. One of them is called Liturgy for Living. That book was written right after the 1979 prayer book came out, as a way to reflect on it, to talk some more about it. It's a great little text if you want to just read more about the prayer book. The other one is called Praying Shapes Believing. That was one of the books that I read right before I went to seminary. It calls itself a theological commentary on the Book of Common Prayer. Great little guide to the prayer book. One of the best parts about it, I think, is its first section on the church calendar. I know, how boring can it be? But believe me, it actually was kind of interesting. So those are some additional resources for you as we continue and as we launch off in the study called Liturgy, the Work of the People. So here's the question that is in that book, Liturgy for Living, that is going to guide our entire series this fall. Here's the question. Why do Episcopalians do what we do when we gather on Sundays and other special days of the year in the presence of God? Why do Episcopalians do what we do? Now, a lot of times at the parish level, when we're talking about liturgy and worship, we spend a lot of times on the other questions about the who, the what, the when, the where. Who are the acolytes today? What times are the service? What lessons are we leading? In this time of pandemic and social distancing, Where is the service going to be? Is it going to be in the chapel or the nave or outside or online? And those are all really important questions. But like I said, during this time, I want us to step back a little bit. I want us to think more about the why questions. Why do Episcopalians do what we do? That is going to be the thing that guides us for this whole semester. And you think about all the different things that we've done at Holy Comforter. There's a lot that we've done. I see there the picture of Bishop Doyle baptizing at our opening service in the new church. There's a picture of Deacon Bob reading from the gospel. And as I just mentioned, there's a picture of our dedication, our groundbreaking service for the new church. And we have to say each one of these things, the sacraments, the way we encounter physical space and sacred spaces, the way even we read scripture texts, both in Bible study and in worship, are different. Or there are particular Episcopalian ways that we do those things. And so we need to think about those. Why do we prefer having communion instead of morning prayer on regular Sundays? Why do we just read out of the Bible on Sunday mornings? Why don't we read any of the other really great Christian texts that are out there? Why don't we read from C.S. Lewis? Why don't we read from Martin Luther King Jr.? Why don't we read from anybody else except for these texts from the Bible? I think that's actually an important question to ask. Now, why do we go to church on Sunday and not other days? Why are some feast days of the Lord, why do they take precedence over that Sunday? And why do sometimes the Sunday bumps the feast day of the Lord? These are all the questions that we're going to get into. And of course, importantly also, why do we baptize babies? Why do we build churches? All those questions of why is really what I want to get into during our time this fall. Today, being a good historian, I want to step back and I want to talk about liturgy, the work of the people. And I should say that the Greek word liturgia really translate as the work of the people, right? So when we talk about liturgy, when we're talking about what we're doing in church, we are talking about this thing that we all do together as the people of God. So I want to talk about the history in three big movements. The first one is the English Reformation. Now, you'll remember from my confirmation classes, I hope you remember from my confirmation classes, that going into the 16th century, and let's focus on England because we're Episcopalians and from the Church of England, all the worship services were taking place in Latin. I think that's an important thing to remember. Think that if you were French or Italian or Spanish or Portuguese, and those languages are related to Latin, you would at least go into church and have some sort of gist as to what was going on. But if you speak a Germanic language, like German or Swiss or English, you have no earthly idea what's going on because your language is not related. And if actually you look at the places where there was a Reformation, it's not surprising. England, Germany, Switzerland. So the big movement here that I want to just reiterate is that in the 16th century, it was very important that the Book of Common Prayer became this thing that was in English, so that the people in England would go to church on Sundays and on other days, right? And they would hear the entire liturgy in their own language. Super duper important. Now, the drawback of that, of course, was the loss of uniformity. And I think that is probably one of the best arguments, reasons, whatnot, for the services in Latin, is that it was a one language for all of God's people. But of course, I think it's okay to lose that so that the people can understand the worship services in their own language. Now, of course, this is balanced by the printing press. Think of what the printing press did. We always talk about the Gutenberg Bible, which obviously is important, but think of it important in terms of liturgical texts and prayer books. This allowed for a mass production of prayer books, which actually allowed for greater conformity in England to the Book of Common Prayer, because there could be a mass publication of these prayer books. I know it's kind of weird to think about that before then, those books would have been rare or treasured. This is partially why Bibles were actually chained to the church lectern, because they were so valuable. There are actually great pictures of these giant manacles holding the Bible into church, which is kind of funny. But think of how the printing press technologically allowed for this new conformity and uniformity. So when Elizabeth I comes along in the latter half of the 16th century and says, everybody is going to use the prayer book, she's really able to say that because of the technology that allowed for all of those prayer books to be floating out there. We're going to be talking a lot about how technology has influenced liturgy. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Welcome to 2020. The next big movement that I want to point out is the Oxford movement in the 19th century. Now, it's kind of a funny story how all this got started. It was hot one day in a little parish church in England, and the warden of the church climbed up on top of the altar to open some of the windows to allow for a little bit more ventilation. The priest was aghast, and from that came two movements, the Cambridge movement and then the Oxford movement. In these movements, we see that church worship begins to look more like what we know today, especially when it comes to vestments, liturgical colors, and even matching communion sets. Those things were not part of the church on a whole before the 19th century. I know that that's kind of strange for us as Episcopalians to think that liturgical colors are a new thing. They are a very new thing. It was not really part of what was going on in the church until the 19th century and the Oxford movement and all these people saying we really ought to make the church worship more regimented, have some more decorum, and now we can buy all of these nice things because of the Industrial Revolution. Again, technology influences in profound ways how we worship. Think of it, the mass production of affordable textiles allowed for churches to buy vestments that matched. Same thing with silverware, right? It's really only because of the Industrial Revolution that churches are able to have all of those nice things. So that's really where a lot of this standardization comes from. It's not some ancient church thing. It's because of the Industrial Revolution. Again, technology shapes the way we pray and the way we worship. Now, the third big movement I want to talk about is the liturgical renewal movement of the 20th century. The high water mark of this was the Second Vatican Council, right? And you know, the Roman Catholic Church followed us in a way and said that the worship of the church was to be done in the language of the people who were there. I think that's important. You know, they sort of said the same at Vatican II. What was going on for Episcopalians was similar, and that's when the revision to the Book of Common Prayer started for the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, the one that we use now. Now, it was partially part of this big liturgical renewal movement, but it was also to reclaim some of the ancient rites of the Christian churches. That would be things like Holy Communion every Sunday, baptism in living water, running water. There's one little church, St. Francis Episcopal Church in Temple, Texas. It was actually built, instead of a baptismal font in the back that just had a basin of water, it was actually built with a sort of a creek running along inside of it so that people would be baptized in living water, which I think is kind of neat. Now, again, technology played a role in the liturgical renewal movement, especially in the drafting of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. Any of you folks who have been Episcopalians for a while will remember the Green Book and the Zebra Book. These were two trial use prayer books that were given to certain parishes, and the parishes were to worship with them and then give their feedback to the Episcopal Church as they were revising the prayer book. Can you imagine being the people who had to read those comments? Oh, that would have been awful. Think of all the things people were saying about those two trial liturgies. I actually have a Green Book and a Zebra Book, and it's kind of fun just to flip back and look through at some of those. Then, of course, there was a proposed Book of Common Prayer in 1976, and then a final adopted Book of Common Prayer in 1979. I think the technological, not so much technological innovation, but technological capacity here to think that all of those books, Green Book, Zebra Book, Proposed Book of Common Prayer, and Real Book of Common Prayer, could have been put together, produced, published, shipped out, and all of those comments received back within 6 years is actually, I think, pretty amazing. And that shows, again, that technology is influencing the way we worship, and that prayer book revision could happen so quickly. Now, so why all this background? It's important for us to remember as Episcopalians that we are not this church that has just dropped down into 2020 without any past. We are a historic faith with received tradition. So think of it as sedimentary rock here, as I'm showing, that I do think that the church, it builds upon layers and layers of the past. You can never just get rid of the past. Say we were going to plant a new Episcopal church. Well, you couldn't just dump all the old stuff and start all brand new again. Just like the sedimentary rock here, is that it's actually layers building on top of each other. Of course, some layers are bigger than others. Some stick out more in our minds, but it's up to us then, as part of this historic faith and this historic tradition, especially liturgically, is to build faithfully upon what has come before. And I think it all gets back to that first question: why do Episcopalians do what we do? And I think to answer that question, part of what we have to do is look at this whole strata of history. So, one part of what we're going to do in our series here, Liturgy, the Work of the People, is that I'm going to ask you to journal. Every week, I'm going to have a journal question for you. This would usually be the time when we were in the parish hall, we would all start talking to one another in our small groups, our table groups. And those conversations will take place in our monthly discussion group. But weekly, I want you to find a journal, piece of paper, on your computer, whatever, to start journaling some of these questions. And the question for today is, why are you an Episcopalian? Now, notice the question is not, why do you go to Holy Comforter? The question is, why do you worship in this way? Why do you do what we do? Why do you worship in this particular Episcopal Anglican way? Why is the prayer book important to you? Why is the presence of God made known to you in the ways that we worship? So that's where I want us to start today, is to think a little bit about the past, where we've come from in those big three movements, and then to ruminate on that, to pray about it, to think about it, and then to answer that question: why are you an Episcopalian? Of course, if you have any more questions about any of this as we continue along in Liturgy, the Work of the People, by all means, I am here to talk with you, email with you, any of that. I don't want any of you to say, oh, Jimmy, we know you're so busy right now, so I'm not going to ask you this question. No, this is the stuff that I love to talk about, that I think is actually really, really important, especially during this time of pandemic, to take, like I said, that step back and to really think about how we worship and why we worship in these ways. So I'm not too busy. I would love to hear from you. Next Sunday, August 30th will be our first discussion section. There will be a brief video like this, and then at 10 a.m. we will gather on Zoom for a conversation, our kickoff conversation for Liturgy, the work of the people.